Chapter 29, Wilsonian Progressivism at Home and Abroad, 1912-1916. And we got Murdoch in the studio. Good boy. A few key points here. First of all, a third party is going to emerge, right, with Roosevelt's Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. And when that happens, it causes a split in the Republican vote and therefore pretty much guarantees the Democrats a win. And there, Woodrow Wilson enters the scene. Also, progressive ideas have fully integrated into both of the two major parties. And now, by 1914 at least, the United States can no longer be an isolationist nation. Hello, World War I. Right, so as I said here, in 1912, the Democrats are going to run Woodrow Wilson. He's a reformist leader. He runs on a strong progressive platform, which he calls New Freedom. And this has stronger antitrust laws. It has banking reform and tariff reductions. Democrats favored small enterprise and entrepreneurship. They favored free functioning of unregulated and unmonopolized markets, but they did not support social welfare programs that Roosevelt and his party supported. Can you hit this? Go ahead and pause it if you'd like to. We will hit it in class. Teddy Roosevelt runs as a third party, right? His Bull Moose Party is a progressive Republican party, and he has this idea of new nationalism, which includes stronger control of the trusts, women's suffrage, and programs for social welfare. Roosevelt was actually shot during the campaign. He recovered quite quickly. Here is a picture of the bloody shirt, which the text suggests he waved while giving speeches. And here's those teeth we keep hearing about. The election in 1912 offered voters a choice of policies and economic philosophies, which is a rarity in U.S. history. Do you support new freedom and small business enterprise entrepreneurship? Or do you support new nationalism with government control of the trusts and social welfare? Regardless of which of those you prefer, both candidates favored a more active government role in economic and social affairs, and so that sort of sets a trend moving forward. As I said, the Republican vote was split, and of course Wilson wins. Roosevelt's Progressive Party actually dies out. As the text said, the Socialist Party had more people in elected positions than the Bull Moose or Progressive Republicans did, so this is pretty much the end of that party. You can see on the map here that the Democrats win the electoral vote quite easily, but keep in mind Wilson is a minority president. He does not have a majority of the popular vote. So it's 42% right there. Wilson was a scholar, right? He's the former president of Princeton University, and he gave lectures on government. He also was the former governor of New Jersey. In many cases there, he went above the party bosses' heads and appealed directly to the people. So he is intelligent, and he might be a great person to take charge in this sort of progressive era. But it said in the text that he also lacked people skills. He didn't have that kind of charismatic personality that, say, Roosevelt had, and so people saw him as cold. He really relied on this sort of moral righteousness that he believed he had, and he was quite stubborn in terms of compromising because of that. President Wilson sets out to attack the triple wall of privilege, including the tariff, the banks, and the trusts. And so he calls a special meeting in Congress in 1913 to address the tariff. Here he convinced Congress to pass the Underwood Tariff Bill, which significantly reduced the tariff. And the 16th Amendment was also ratified in 1913, and this enabled Congress to collect a graduated income tax directly from the people. Now, the most serious problem of the National Banking Act, which was passed during the Civil War, was the inelasticity of money. In times of financial stress, banking reserves, which were located in New York and other large cities, just couldn't distribute money fast enough into areas of need. So in 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. This establishes the Federal Reserve Board, which is appointed by the president, and it oversaw a nationwide system of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. Each reserve bank was the central bank for its region, and the final authority of the Federal Reserve Board guaranteed a substantial level of public control. The board could also issue paper currency called Federal Reserve notes, which is the U.S. dollar that we have today. Because of this, the amount of money in circulation could be increased as needed for the requirements of business. And here you can see the geographic boundaries of those 12 Federal Reserve districts, and we here in New England are in District 1. The final piece of that triple wall of privilege will be the trusts, and under Wilson's administration we'll see the creation of the Federal Trade Commission in and the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. Again, both these are dealing with interstate commerce, which is the true power of Congress, right, in terms of economic power in 1914. The Federal Trade Commission oversaw interstate commerce, as I said, and it could issue cease and desist orders to companies that were engaged in unfair business tactics. And under the Clayton Antitrust Act, the list of business practices that were deemed objectionable was increased. And possibly more importantly, it exempted labor and agricultural organizations from antitrust prosecution, so laborers can't be prosecuted as trusts. And of course, union leaders such as Samuel Gompers were pretty much on board with that. Just a great line in the American pageant. I wanted to read it to you. Energetically scaling the triple wall of privilege, Woodrow Wilson had treated the nation to a dazzling demonstration of vigorous presidential leadership. Basically, he's quite popular for the things that he had accomplished early on, and as a result of that, he continues on with further regulation. So, La Follette Seamen's Act 1915 helps sailors. They get a decent wage and decent treatment, which actually kind of hurts prices because shippers have to pay their sailors more, so prices go up. The Federal Farm Loan Act, as you can see, provides low interest rate loans to farmers, and also the Warehouse Act enabled farmers to take out loans against the value of their staple crops, which are being stored in government warehouses. So probably a response to those disgruntled farmers who helped to form that progressive party at the end of the 19th century. And there's also workmen's compensation in 1916 for federal employees only, but again, a step in the right direction. How about more reform with the Keating-Owen Act in 1916, which really tried to protect children, and basically it made it illegal to ship goods across state lines that are made by child labor. And the Adams Act in 1916 created an 8-hour workday for all employees on trains that are involved with interstate commerce. Now, Wilson really does appeal to the progressives when he appoints Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. He's the first Jewish judge in the Supreme Court. You can see him here. But an election is coming, and so Wilson knows he has to appeal to the conservatives in America as well, and he makes conservative appointments to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Trade Commission in hopes of doing that. To remain in the White House, he said in the pageant, the president would have to woo the bull moose voters into the Democratic fold. Now, on the surface, Woodrow Wilson is anti-war, anti-imperial, very different from the Roosevelt administration, obviously. And in 1914, he repealed the Panama Canal Tolls Act in 1912, which had exempted American coastal shipping from tolls. The Jones Act was passed in 1916, which granted the Philippines a territorial status and put them on a path to independence. They would be freed as soon as their government was deemed to be established and stable. And you might know that the Philippines don't actually become independent until 1946. In Haiti, 1915, however, though, Woodrow Wilson sends in the Marines. And the goal of those Marines are to protect American lives and property. So that's not necessarily imperial, but keep in mind that one of the reasons why we were initially involved in Cuba was, you could say, a humanitarian effort to help the Cubans fight off the oppressive Spanish as well. 1916, Wilson signed a treaty with Haiti that provided the U.S. supervision of finances and the police. And in 1917, Wilson purchased the Virgin Islands from Denmark. So while he is openly anti-imperial, some of the actions he's taking sort of fit in line with the imperialist actions that we've already seen. Wilson's brand of diplomacy comes to be known as moral diplomacy. In 1913, the Mexican Revolution occurs, and the Mexican president was murdered and replaced by General Victoriano Huerta. He was a brutal dictator, and because of the chaos in Mexico that followed his rise to power, millions of Spanish-speaking immigrants came to the United States. Now, Wilson initially refused to directly intervene with this war in Mexico. Instead, he wanted the Mexican citizens to do something about this. He hoped they would overthrow this government themselves. However, after a small party of American sailors were accidentally captured by the Mexicans, something known as the Tampico Incident, Wilson ordered the Navy to seize the Mexican port of Veracruz. Now, just as war seemed imminent with Mexico, the ABC powers, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, intervened and pressured Huerta to step down, and Venustiano Carranza became the president of Mexico following that. Now, Pancho Villa was a rival of President Carranza, and he was attempting to provoke a war between Mexico and the U.S. by killing Americans. He and his band were sort of crossing over the border back and forth between Mexico and Texas, and as a result of that, Wilson ordered General John J. Pershing, Blackjack Pershing, down there to Panchovia and his outlaws. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you look at it, war was looming in 1917, with Germany that is, and as a result, the United States pulled Blackjack Pershing out and actually sent him overseas. Wanted to show you this map so you can see that the United States was quite involved in Latin America. I think you know this already, but it's that Monroe Doctrine, right? And that sort of opened the door to American intervention in various places. And this is not new, obviously. Here's a cartoon of Teddy and his big stick diplomacy in the Caribbean. And so, you kind of have this idea that I think they call it a Yankee Lake in the American pageant, that being the Caribbean. By the way, it is February 11th in New England. It's cold and rainy, and I'm just thinking about the Caribbean right now, and it looks like fun. 4.5 months to summer, folks. It'll be fine. As I alluded to, World War I is beginning. In fact, 1914 it begins when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was murdered by a Serbian. And Austria had the backing of Germany, and they presented Serbia a series of demands. And Serbia did not necessarily comply with those, and they had the backing of Russia. And this is that alliance system that I think you all are familiar with. And as you probably know, it quickly broke down as these countries began declaring war on one another. And soon enough, we have a full-out world war. Here is the moment of truth for poor Franz Ferdinand. Once the fighting begins, Wilson issues his neutrality proclamation. However, the text tells us there's a strong anti-German sentiment in the United States. Americans, it says, viewed Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany as the embodiment of arrogant autocracy. However, most Americans were just opposed to getting involved in a European war. Once war breaks out in Europe, American industry begins to boom as we trade war supplies and food with European nations. And technically, as a neutral nation, we could trade with anybody. That said, there's a British blockade in the North Sea, which prevented American trade with Germany. Now, the Germans are not happy with that, and so in 1915, they begin to use these U-boats, these Untersea boats, quite effectively. And Berlin did say that they would try not to sink neutral ships, but they warned that mistakes might be made. Woodrow Wilson responds to that by saying that Germany would be held to strict accountability for any attacks on American vessels or American citizens. Now, in May of 1915, a German U-boat sunk the British ocean liner, the Lusitania, killing roughly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. And so now Wilson's kind of up against his own word here, but he does oppose war, as did most people who lived in the eastern United States. What he did was he sent a series of notes to Germany and really tried to convince them not to do this any longer. Of course, Woodrow Wilson's heavily criticized by folks like Teddy Roosevelt. Incidentally, William Jennings Bryan thought that those notes were just too much, and in fact, he resigned. In 1915, another British liner, the Arabic, was sunk. The Lusitania, I should mention, was carrying 4,200 cases of small arms ammunition. I don't know what the Arabic had on board, but 2 Americans did die. Following this, Berlin reluctantly agreed not to sink unarmed and unresisting passenger ships without warning. Here's a map of that blockade, you can see. So this use of submarine warfare against any ship in the war zone is called unrestricted submarine warfare, and Germany later sunk a French passenger steamer as well. It was called the Sussex. And following that, Wilson sent an ultimatum, and basically he said, if you don't stop using unrestricted submarine warfare, we will cut off diplomatic relations with you, which is most certainly a step closer to war. Now, Germany agreed. They would not sink unarmed ships without warning, but they attached to that agreement a request or a caveat that the United States would have to convince the Allies to stop the blockade. That's just not possible for Wilson to do. Here's a map of those submarine attacks. September 1916 and 1917, each ship is represented by a dot on the map. Quite a few in the English Channel especially. Here is a nice picture of a U-boat. And here's a map of 1917 and 1918. Again, these are different ships, so very heavily concentrated around the ports in the English Channel. Now, while this nonsense with the submarines is taking place, we have a presidential election to deal with, and the Progressive Party and the Republican Party will meet in 1916, and they nominate Teddy Roosevelt. He, however, refuses to run. He does not want to split the Republican vote again. And so the Republicans will choose Supreme Court Justice Charles Evan Hughes, and their platform condemned the Democratic tariff, assaults on the trust, and Wilson's dealings with Mexico and Germany. The Democrats run Wilson again on this idea of peace and the slogan of "he kept us out of the war." And fortunately for Wilson, he wins. And what follows the year after that is war. That's it for tonight. That is a short chapter. A lot of information in there, but definitely a short chapter. Murdoch is passed out of sleep, just like you all in class when I get talking. Hope you had a great night. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or just let me know in class. Take care.